the Managing Director of Corporate Racial Equity and Legal at PolicyLink, which is the National Research and Action Institute at the forefront of advancing racial and economic equity in America. She is a member of PolicyLink's leadership team and works to ignite the racial equity movement more broadly and deeply across corporate America, leading a portfolio of strategic initiatives, including co-founding the Corporate Racial Equity Alliance, which you're going to hear about with FSG and Just Capital. And she began her career as a corporate attorney at an international law firm, representing large and small companies on a broad range of commercial and corporate matters. And Mahlet brings a unique perspective as a first-generation Ethiopian immigrant and has also traveled and studied in China, India, Nepal, and Zimbabwe. And she holds a BA in East Asian Studies from Lewis and Clark College and a JD from the University of Virginia School of Law. So Mahlet, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Shuma, and the entire team for having me today. Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you all for this important gathering on how we can catalyze the private sector toward more deeply contributing to long-lasting community health and well-being. I'm excited to share with you a bit about my experience working with companies to advance racial and economic equity in particular. But first, I want to share a little bit about what brought me to this work. 2 years ago, it was the summer of 2020, I left my position as a general counsel in corporate America and joined PolicyLink to help advance racial equity in the private sector because two things were crystal clear to me. One, advancing racial equity is an essential pathway to addressing the breadth and scale of the social and economic challenges before us, including achieving community health and well-being in historically underinvested communities. Two, it was also clear to me after over 13 years working with and for corporations that the business community is already on the leading edge of the racial equity movement, but they just don't know it yet. What do I mean by that? After centuries of racism and exclusion and exploitation from all sectors in our society, especially businesses, we have nearly 100 million people in America living at or below the poverty line. That includes half of all people of color in this nation. It also includes 1/4 of all white people, all of whom are struggling to make ends meet in the richest nation in the history of mankind. Redesigning business to effectively serve people of color, to effectively serve people living in economic insecurity, and our communities more broadly is one of our nation's greatest challenges. It's also our greatest opportunity to finally live up to our highest ideals. To put a finer point on it, all of our futures are embedded in the topic of racial equity. We cannot achieve community health and well-being without advancing racial equity. And we cannot advance racial equity without businesses alongside us in this work. It's all interconnected. The other way I see businesses on the leading edge of this work, I know firsthand that we have yet to tap into the vast potential of businesses to contribute meaningfully to advancing racial equity, not just within their four walls, but also across communities. On an annual basis in the US, the nonprofit sector has something like $1 trillion to address social issues. The US government has something like $3 trillion. And meanwhile, in the private sector, there's an estimated $22 trillion in resources annually. On top of that, we know that businesses possess unique skills in moving capital and investing, as well as in shifting our legal and regulatory frameworks to their will. Further, we're in a time of incredibly unprecedented shifts in the priorities of workers and young people and the American public generally. The cover of this year's Edelman's famous Trust Barometer declared unabashedly that societal leadership is now a core function of business. So imagine bringing together all of the unique skills that businesses have, ably and equitably directed and wielded to unlock the equity wins we need to achieve our highest ideals. Today, I'm excited to share two bodies of our work with you that make an effort to do that. The first is our CEO blueprint for racial equity, and the other is our multi-year effort to develop business standards on racial and economic equity. I'll also share a bit about where I see the biggest challenges for companies in advancing equity across communities. The guiding ethos in all of the work that we do at PolicyLink and with our partners is equity. And we define that as just and fair inclusion into a society in which all of us, not just some of us, can participate, prosper, and reach our full potential. Now, PolicyLink has been in this work advancing racial and economic equity for over 2 decades. And over the years, it became very clear that achieving our goals would require not just civil society and government working together, but as you heard from Deborah, also businesses working in concert to improve the lives of the nearly 100 million economically insecure people in America living in or near poverty, the majority of whom, as I mentioned, are people of color. So starting in 2016, together with our partners, FSG and Just Capital, we started to identify and amplify through published research how corporations can advance racial and economic equity while also creating business value and broad-based benefits to communities across the nation and all of society. Our research shows that when businesses address the needs of the most vulnerable within their ranks and across the communities in which they operate, all of society benefits. Specifically, in 2021, we published a new CEO blueprint for racial equity in partnership again with FSG and Just Capital. And the blueprint aims to connect all of this great intention that we see in the private sector with really transformational and long-lasting change on equity. It guides business leaders beyond narrow diversity and inclusion commitments to enterprise-wide action by recommending critical levers that leaders can pull within their 4 walls, but also beyond that, the levers that leaders can pull to play a productive role within the communities in which they operate. We believe to authentically pursue racial equity and achieve shared prosperity and community health, business strategies must be mutually reinforcing across all of the domains of their influence, not just HR, not just products and services, but also how communities show up in communities, how companies show up in communities, and also how they show up on the national stage, well beyond philanthropy alone. So to give you a few examples of what I mean about this blueprint, within the 4 walls, it means embedding accountability for racial equity within corporate governance and leadership performance, such as establishing board oversight of a business's racial equity strategies. It also means adopting anti-racist HR policies and practices, expanding worker power and voice, and designing products and services to center racially equitable outcomes. Before the 4 walls of the company, beyond the 4 walls, and why we're all here today, the blueprint lays out the actions that companies can take within the communities in which they operate, including actions related to building trust and relationships authentically in communities of color, redesigning corporate philanthropy to address root causes, advocating for local policies that address structural inequities, applying a do no harm lens to local policy positions, and mitigating environmental impacts on communities of color. At the broader societal level, we're also saying companies need to take action with national level public policy by advocating for policies that reduce racialized outcomes, invest philanthropic and political action dollars directly in voting rights infrastructure at the grassroots level, and make long-term community investments to promote racial and economic equity. Also using industry influence to bring other companies along, acting in coalition. I know that's a lot. It's just a high-level overview, but it is on purpose. The blueprint is meant to cover 360 degrees of a corporation's influence and impact. It's meant to embed equity deep into the DNA of the company and set the foundation for a whole new way of doing business, with racial equity as a key driver of productive and equitable growth, with racial equity as a key driver of collective well-being. Now, the blueprint has been very well received by the private sector, but we also know that it is incredibly overwhelming with over 70 actions, and that taking on such comprehensive work is not easy. There are common barriers and challenges that we see across companies large and small every day. And so today I'll share with you all just the top 3 that I see the greatest barriers for companies, especially as they look to make a positive impact in the communities in which they operate. Now, the 3 barriers I'll talk about, they're based on my own experience in the private sector, our one-on-one engagements with companies, and targeted research that we undertook in the months following the release of the blueprint, where we solicited feedback directly from C-suite leaders across the nation to understand their level of engagement in racial equity work beyond their public statements and their greatest needs for guidance in centering equity within their 4 walls and across the communities in which they operate in. So the first challenge that we typically see is about building trust through transparency. It's important for business leaders to make the connection between rebuilding trust with workers and communities of color and being more transparent about their policies and practices, being more transparent about their decision-making, their intentions in community investment, and where they are on their racial equity journeys. After decades of lackluster results on DEI and centuries of capital and prosperity largely concentrated in the hands of the few, trust is understandably broken at the community level. It's broken among workers. So rebuilding trust is going to require multiple interventions, and one of them is much greater rigor around data and much more transparency. Transparency doesn't require perfection, though. This is something that's often misunderstood. It doesn't require change overnight either. Instead, it requires a willingness to hold the organization and business leaders accountable to continuous improvement and ultimately achieving equitable outcomes. Not surprisingly, in my work, there's widespread discomfort and even resistance amongst business leaders with disclosure on many fronts, especially on sharing disaggregated demographic data relating to the workforce and their suppliers, around disclosures on corporate political activity. As a former corporate lawyer and general counsel, I get it, but this is one of the keys to rebuilding trust with communities and workers. Businesses, they need to know where they're at, and they need to share where they're at and tell the real story. Flashy marketing campaigns and bold commitments alone are no longer going to cut it. One way to get through this is to act and disclose in coalition with other companies. That's just one of the ways, and there must be others. But there are no shortcuts to rebuilding trust, and it will require intentional investment of time and resources. The second challenge we typically see is around shifting power. A fundamental component of achieving racial equity is ensuring that historically excluded groups are proportionately represented in positions of power and leadership, and that those most impacted by injustice and underinvestment are actual decision makers in the design and implementation of equitable solutions. It's time to rethink and expand who's making decisions about where and how capital is invested, who owns and benefits, and who governs when the most important decisions are made. What we see workers and communities needing and demanding more of is greater power over decisions that deeply affect their day-to-day lives. And the fact is that those in power right now often have very little proximity to the greatest challenges experienced by workers and communities. So it makes perfect sense to ensure that those with proximity to the issues we aim to solve actually play a key role in decision-making around solutions. Shifting power means not only building and strengthening authentic community relationships, but also directly engaging and prioritizing communities in decisions about investments. I also see shifting power as just a long overdue evolution of corporate governance to be more equitable. Yet, like the other challenge, we still see a great deal of discomfort over the idea, even the phrase shifting power. Leaders that are willing to lean into this discomfort, though, they'll understand that shifting power is really just about operationalizing the alignment of long-term interests between workers and communities on the one hand, and businesses on the other hand. Now, the third challenge is that there's an overwhelming sense of urgency within businesses to take some action to advance racial equity, but also tunnel vision about the nature of racial equity work. The combination of these two forces presents a significant barrier to more meaningful change. We know, and research demonstrates, that long-term strategies are more likely to create lasting impact. But many business leaders, under tremendous pressure, have an overpowering sense of urgency to respond to the public's expectations of change with quick actions. On top of this, business leaders often think of racial equity quite narrowly, as just about diversifying the workforce and suppliers and undertaking some philanthropic activities. But as you heard in my overview of the CEO Blueprint for Racial Equity, it is much more than that. This sense of urgency and tunnel vision often results, though, in companies having wildly inconsistent strategies, announcing bold reforms and investments in some areas, while simultaneously doubling down unintentionally on harmful policies and practices in other areas. The fact is, we're not going to achieve broad-based community health and equity, and we'll keep having these same conversations unless business leaders apply a really cohesive approach to their efforts across the business in line with the blueprint. That means, together with investing in communities where companies operate, they also need to assess their public policy positions and reconsider their tax mitigation strategies. Companies that boldly lead in this manner will be really well positioned to achieve sustained change, earn much needed trust, make meaningful impacts in communities, and meet the increased leadership expectations of their stakeholders, especially communities of color, in the years ahead. One thing I tell business leaders and investors around this is that racial equity, it's not like climate. There are no racial equity offsets. Don't expect or seek credit for one-time action. Don't expect or seek credit while other areas of the business may be harming workers and communities. Instead, strive for total transformation, making advancing equity just a normal part of everyday business. So what do all these barriers add up to? The fact is that if we don't push companies in all the ways, if we allow tremendous resources to be invested in communities and powerful initiatives to be launched, but we're not also pushing for enterprise-wide transformation from corporate governance to political activity, we will continue to risk lackluster results. We will risk proliferating equity washing and equity wishing at a time when what we really need is bold leadership like we've never experienced before from the business community. Now I'll share very quickly with you a little bit about our corporate standards effort, but it connects to the anchor approach that we're discussing here, because I see the application. First, I see the application of the anchor approach to the private sector is incredibly compelling and powerful, and I hope it takes hold more broadly and deeply. But I also see how it can take hold in the standards work that we're doing. And so I'll share that with you now. We know the blueprint is definitely not sufficient to align market actors around how to measure, how to approach, how to report and incentivize progress in advancing racial equity by the business community. There's a lot of personal work that business leaders have to undertake as part of their organization's readiness, that's for sure. But also we need a more rigorous and unified approach for building equitable corporations. So we're now engaged in this multi-year effort with FSG and Just Capital to develop robust corporate performance standards on racial and economic equity with a broad ecosystem of partners. Our standards project is about developing the standardized impact and performance measures for business across the full spectrum of the CEO blueprint. We're leading this effort with FSG and Just Capital, and we're working together with partners such as B-Lab, the Global Impact Investing Network, CAPIQ, and many others. We kicked off the process last year with a survey just asking the public, what would be important to you as we embark on this effort? And the results show that those in the private sector and civil society alike, they want a uniform set of standards for corporations, and they most want those standards to influence the prioritization of advancing equity in the private sector, to improve corporate accountability for impacts on people of color and communities, and to drive alignment on good corporate practices and disclosures that advance racial equity. We were so excited to see those results. And in April of this year, we hit another critical milestone in our work By releasing our standards framework and methodology, along with a sampling of the KPIs, the key performance indicators that we plan to develop, including around equitable worker compensation, environmental justice, and corporate political activity. We then engaged with members of the public over a 60-day period to get their feedback through 11 public roundtables and an online survey. Over half of the 300 people we reached during that period were people of color. Nearly half were people living in economic insecurity, and over a third were people under 24 years old, representing the voice of the next generation of workers, investors, and business leaders. We also engaged frontline and essential workers, board members, investors, racial equity experts, academics, public sector workers, and many others. And we're now in this process of translating the rich feedback we received into a full set of KPIs, including focused on business impacts across communities, such as authentically building trust and relationships in communities, how companies ought to advocate for local policies that address structural inequities in communities, and how they should operate and invest equitably in communities as well. The standards are going to set a really high bar for what good looks like on equity, and the goal is to point the way forward and establish consistency for how businesses should approach, measure, disclose, and speak publicly about their equity journeys. We know no company is going to hit the high bars that we're setting right away, but we'll rally around a bold vision for equity with interim KPIs along the way to support businesses in getting there. Now, there's much more I could share about our standards development effort, but I'll stop there and welcome anyone to reach out if there's interest in learning more and getting involved. Core to our development effort is engaging with the broad spectrum of corporate stakeholders. So there's many opportunities to help us shape these standards in a really meaningful way. And as I mentioned, I see the standards as an opportunity to normalize businesses using anchor approaches to advance community health and equity. Timing-wise, our goal is to release the standards next year and concurrently launch another public comment period, as well as a pilot with a small cohort of companies. Now, in conclusion, if there's only one thing you remember about my talk today, remember this, that achieving racial equity is a defining opportunity of our time. We are abundantly able to do this with the resources we have, and it's critical to center racial equity when we think about community health. Businesses have a powerful and essential role to play in this, but we're not going to get there if we tinker around the edges, if we make small bets, or if we fail to hold ourselves and businesses that we're advocating to do more on accountable to results. Thank you.